NCIS Origins, S02E13. Homeward Bound Preview. Ducky returns. The rain had a way of making Washington, D.C. feel older than it really was. Streets shimmered under flickering streetlights, and the world seemed quieter, like it was holding its breath. Inside the bullpen, however, silence was never permanent. Leroy Jethro Gibbs stood by his desk, staring at a case file he wasn't really reading. The edges of the paper had softened from being handled too many times in too few hours. Something about this case didn't sit right, and that usually meant it was personal, whether he wanted it to be or not. "Boss," came a voice from behind. Gibbs didn't turn. "You ever get the feeling something's missing, Franks?" Mike Franks leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his expression unreadable but knowing. "Kid, something's always missing. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before Gibbs could answer, the elevator doors opened with a soft ding. All eyes turned instinctively. It wasn't often they got visitors this late. The man who stepped out carried an umbrella, dripping slightly onto the polished floor. His coat was neatly pressed despite the weather, and his posture, upright, composed, seemed almost out of place in the chaos of the bullpen. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Gibbs finally turned and froze. "Ducky?" he said, disbelief creeping into his voice. Dr. Donald Ducky Mallard gave a faint, familiar smile. "Ah, Jethro. Still allergic to umbrellas, I see." Franks let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned." Ducky stepped forward, closing the umbrella with careful precision. "I do apologize for the late hour, gentlemen, but I'm afraid this couldn't wait." Gibbs recovered quickly, though the surprise lingered in his eyes. "What are you doing here?" Ducky's expression shifted, just slightly, but enough for Gibbs to notice. "I believe," he said softly, "I may have information relevant to your current investigation." Franks raised an eyebrow. "Funny, we didn't exactly broadcast that." "No," Ducky replied, "but some threads have a way of finding their way back to us, no matter how tightly we think they're tied off." Gibbs gestured toward the conference room. "Let's talk." Inside the room, the air felt heavier. Files were spread across the table, photographs pinned in haphazard order. A map of the East Coast was marked with red ink, locations tied to a string of disappearances that had begun to feel less like coincidence and more like something deliberate. Ducky studied the materials with a careful eye, his fingers hovering just above the images as though afraid to disturb them. "These men," he murmured, "all former Navy. All with remarkably similar service records. And yet, no obvious connection beyond that." "That's the problem," Gibbs said. "No motive. No pattern." Ducky tilted his head slightly. "On the contrary, Jethro, I believe there is a pattern. You're simply looking at it from the wrong angle." Franks leaned forward. "All right, Doc, enlighten us." Ducky picked up one of the photographs. "Have you considered their medical histories?" Gibbs frowned. "Medical?" "Yes. Specifically, their post-service evaluations." Ducky's gaze sharpened. "There was a program, classified, experimental, conducted quietly, even by naval standards. It focused on neurological resilience." Frank scoffed. "Sounds like a fancy way of saying they messed with soldiers' heads." Ducky didn't disagree. "In essence, yes. But more importantly, the program was shut down abruptly. Records were sealed. Participants dispersed." Gibbs's jaw tightened. "You're saying all these men were part of that program?" "I am suggesting," Ducky said carefully, "that they may share more than just a uniform." A silence settled over the room. Then Gibbs asked the question that had been forming in his mind since Ducky walked in. "How do you know about this?"
Ducky hesitated.
For the first time since his arrival, he seemed uncertain. I was consulted, he admitted. Years ago. Not officially, of course, merely as a second opinion. Franks let out a dry laugh. Of course. Gibbs's eyes narrowed. And you didn't think to mention this before? Ducky met his gaze, steady but weighted with something deeper. At the time, I believed the matter had been resolved. Clearly, I was mistaken. Later that night, Gibbs stood alone in autopsy. The room felt different with Ducky back in it, even if only temporarily. Familiar, but also complicated. Ducky entered quietly, removing his coat and hanging it with practiced ease. You always did prefer this room when you needed to think? Gibbs didn't look up. You always did show up when things got complicated. A faint smile touched Ducky's lips. I shall take that as a compliment. Gibbs finally turned. You're not telling me everything. Ducky sighed softly. No, I'm not. The honesty caught Gibbs off guard. Why now? Gibbs asked. Why come back? Ducky stepped closer to the examination table, resting his hands lightly against its surface. Because, Jethro, this case isn't just about those men. Gibbs's expression hardened. Then what is it about? Ducky looked at him, really looked at him. It's about what was done to them, he said quietly, and what may still be happening. A beat passed. And, Ducky added, almost reluctantly, it may also be about you. The words lingered long after Ducky left the room. Gibbs stood there, unmoving, the weight of them settling into something he couldn't quite define. About you. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He didn't like cases that circled back. Didn't like the idea that something from the past, something buried, might not be as buried as he'd thought. Across the bullpen, Franks watched him, reading him the way only he could. Kid, Franks called out, you planning to stand there all night, or you gonna do something? Gibbs grabbed his jacket. Yeah, he said, I'm gonna do something. As the team regrouped, the energy had shifted. What had started as a cold case was now something far more dangerous, something with roots that ran deep and consequences that weren't yet clear. And at the center of it all stood Ducky. Not just as a witness, not just as an expert, but as someone who knew more than he was saying. The final shot lingered on him as he stood alone outside the building, the rain beginning to fall once more. He looked up at the sky, his expression thoughtful and troubled. Homeward bound, he murmured to himself. But whether he meant returning to the past or escaping it remained to be seen.